Hi, and welcome to ChurchTherapy.com's Pastor Training Videos. I'm Kristen Kinsevich, licensed mental health counselor on staff at East Coast International Church in Lynn, Massachusetts. Today, our video is going to be talking about suicide prevention and response. For those of you that don't know, there is a national suicide hotline, and I just want to make sure that right off the bat, I give you that number. It's 1-800-273-8255. So have that number handy. It's always a good idea to have that either plugged into your phone, written down somewhere that you keep handy in your desk. You never know when you're going to need it, and you don't want to have to be scrambling to look something up. That's just a handy resource to give to people. Also, before we get started, I want to make sure that I've mentioned that it's really important that you as a pastor are aware of the mental health resources in your own community. Usually there is some type of emergency services for psychiatric emergencies that is part of a mental health group in your area. Usually there is a contract that the state will have with an agency in any given region, and so each region has an agency that they're contracted with, and so they provide the emergency services. So in Massachusetts, I know my county, there's an agency that covers this area, and so they are the emergency responders. When someone shows up in an emergency room and they need to be evaluated, sometimes they will come and meet you at the emergency room. You can also go to them or call them. So I would really encourage you, if you don't already know, there should be some type of emergency psychiatric hotline for you to call or for you to let your parishioners know exists. And that should be a 24-hour emergency hotline as well. There's a website, excuse me while I pick this up. There's a website called SAVE.org. It stands for Suicide Awareness Voices of Education. And according to their statistics, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death, and it's actually the second cause of death for 15 to 24-year-olds. So we're not talking about an insignificant part of things that contribute to disability and death. I recently was watching Mental Health in the Church Summit put on by the Leadership Network, and they were talking about how illnesses in general, just a medical definition of illness, is something that can cause disability or death. And when we think about mental illness, we really need to remember that mental illness causes disability and death. And it can be really hard to wrap our heads around how suicide and spirituality can work together. How can you be a Christian and want to take your own life, or be wishing for death? And so one resource that I would recommend in my book, On Edge, Mental Illness in the Christian Context, you can find that on ChurchTherapy.com under the books page. I talk about suicide in one of the chapters, and shared a story of a woman I've known who really struggled with wishing for death, had many attempts on her own life, even as a Christian, and just the reality that it's not really a reflection of what the person themselves truly wants for themselves. It's a manifestation of a sickness. And so really understanding that and treating it as a sickness, I think helps you as a pastor point them towards help more quickly. Just the same way that if someone came in and had some kind of chest pain or serious symptom, you would take them to the emergency room. Just that would be the natural thing you would do. What mental illness we need to look at in much the same way. It's treatable, and it does require a response. Now, let me just walk you through some warning signs of when to maybe put a red flag up and notice that you need to take some things seriously. First of all, anytime someone is talking about wanting to die, wishing they could die, even in a Christian way where, Paul says to live is Christ and to die is gain, we can twist that around and kind of glamorize death in certain ways. So when you notice that someone is really fixated on death, that's something to take seriously. There's never a moment where you want to take that lightly. And there's some warning signs, things like if the person's been really down for a while and then they suddenly have a burst where they feel much better and happier, all of a sudden, and it seems like maybe it doesn't quite feel like it adds up to you. Sometimes when people have made the decision that they are going to kill themselves, it gives them a temporary boost that they feel a little better. They feel a small sense of relief until they go through with it. But during that time, they can also be kind of getting together with people to say almost cryptic goodbye type messages. They might be giving away some of their belongings. So those are some of the warning signs to look for. Certainly if someone's talking with you about feeling really low, having no purpose, having trouble getting out of bed every day, it's worthwhile to ask them if they've had thoughts about wanting to die. You're not going to give someone the suggestion of suicide by talking about it. Sometimes there's that myth out there that if you bring it up, you're putting them at risk. If they're not thinking suicidal thoughts, you're not going to suggest it to them and make them suicidal by talking about it. And if they are thinking about it, then you want to be talking to them about it so that they get it out in the open, because what's kept inside is much more likely to actually be carried out because they feel trapped inside themselves. And so if someone is talking about wanting to die or thinking about death, you want to ask them some questions. Things like, have you been thinking about, actually hurting yourself? Or do you just wish that God would take you, or that God would somehow do it? A lot of times when you ask this question, people say, oh no, I would never do anything to myself. I think, some people think they would go to hell if they did that or whatever. And so whatever their motivation or reason is, you'll usually find that out. If they say, well, you know what, I don't know if I have an exact way I would do it, but yeah, sometimes I think about ways I could just drive off the side of the road or step in front of a train or, whatever, those kinds of things. And so if they have some type of plan or thought about how that they would do it, then you want to ask a little bit further. So first of all, do they have the means? If they live alone and they own some type of gun and they're talking about death, that's an emergency situation that you really need to get them to an emergency room or call a suicide hotline as quickly as possible, because ultimately they have the means and potentially the intent and plan to go ahead and do that. If it's something that, I say, well, you know what, maybe I would, I don't know, think about it in such and such a way, but I don't really, think that I'll do that or whatever, then you're kind of finding out, do they have an intent and do they have a plan? And you really, as a pastor, shouldn't be the one to just assess suicidality on your own, but these are initial questions to begin to ask so that you know how you can best help them get help from the next step. So if a person has some type of active or even passive plan and they think, you know what, I really would like to do that sometime, they may not be saying I'm going to do it right now, but you know what, man, sometimes I just think that would be kind of nice to just end it all. Then you want to kind of find out what resources they're already connected to. Do they already have a counselor that they're seeing? Can they go and talk to their doctor? Find out who they're comfortable with already. And then, certainly offer to take them to the emergency room, have them call a suicide hotline with you in your office, there on speakerphone, or walk them down. Here in our town. I know the door that the agency that I would go to and the door that has the emergency services in it. And so, it's certainly a great option to walk someone down there yourself, or drive them down and have them get help. It might help you as a pastor to sit in with them, not only for their moral support, but then you can kind of hear some of the questions that the counselor would be asking them to kind of evaluate whether or not they should be admitted to a hospital. Depending on how you look at it, fortunately or unfortunately, it is difficult to have someone hospitalized against their will. However, if they cannot make a verbal or written contract that they are going to stay safe, then they can be involuntarily hospitalized by an emergency services worker. And so, again, that's something that just calling 911 and dealing with an ambulance worker, that's going to be a little bit harder than if you've taken them to the emergency room yourself or taken them down to emergency services. So hopefully those are some helpful tips. And again, please have those phone numbers ready so that you don't need to look for them in a moment of crisis. That national hotline that I started with, and the resources in your area. It would be a great idea to even meet with those agencies in your area and hear from them even more about specific tips for suicide prevention. I hope that's been helpful. Thanks for tuning in.